In the context of a potential military conflict between Israel and Iran, determining the outright winner is not straightforward, given the complexities involved in modern warfare and the likely long-term ramifications of such a conflict. While Israel and Iran possess significant military capabilities, their strengths and weaknesses differ, making a direct comparison challenging. Both countries are prepared for a range of conventional and asymmetric threats, and a war between them would not only impact their respective militaries, but also have profound geopolitical, economic, and humanitarian consequences. Israel is widely regarded as one of the most technologically advanced military powers in the Middle East. Its Air Force, the Israeli Air Force, or IAF, is considered a key pillar of its military dominance. The IAF operates cutting-edge aircraft, including U.S.-supplied F-35 stealth fighters, F-15s, and F-16s. The F-35 stealth technology allows Israel to penetrate enemy air defenses effectively, giving it a considerable edge in any aerial confrontation with Iran. Israel has a history of successful airstrikes against regional adversaries, such as its 1981 strike on Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor and its 2007 strike on Syria's nuclear facility, which demonstrate Israel's willingness to act preemptively to protect its security. Iran, on the other hand, has a robust missile program that gives it a long-range strike capability. While its air force is not as advanced as Israel's, Iran compensates with a formidable ballistic missile arsenal, including the Shahab-3 missile with a range of approximately 2,000 kilometers, capable of reaching Israel. Iran has also been developing missiles with greater accuracy and destructive power, such as the Khorramshahr missile, which could pose a significant threat to Israel's military and civilian infrastructure. A direct confrontation between Israeli and Iranian air forces would likely favor Israel, given its advanced technology, training, and experience in modern warfare. However, Iran's missile forces would allow it to retaliate effectively, particularly against Israeli cities and military bases. Israel has a multi-layered missile defense system that includes the Iron Dome for short-range rocket defense, David's Sling for mid-range threats, and the Arrow system for intercepting ballistic missiles. While these systems provide significant protection, they are not foolproof, and a sustained Iranian missile barrage could overwhelm Israeli defenses, inflicting damage on critical infrastructure and civilian areas. Iran's military strategy relies heavily on asymmetric warfare, particularly through its network of proxies across the Middle East. Iran has cultivated deep ties with groups such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shiite militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and various forces in Syria. These proxies provide Iran with a strategic advantage by allowing it to project power beyond its borders and engage in conflict with adversaries without direct confrontation. In the event of a war with Israel, Iran would almost certainly mobilize its proxies to open multiple fronts against Israel. Hezbollah, which possesses an estimated arsenal of over 100,000 rockets and experience in asymmetric warfare, could launch a large-scale rocket campaign against northern Israel, drawing Israel into a protracted conflict that would strain its military resources and lead to significant civilian casualties. While Israel's military is well prepared for such an eventuality, as demonstrated by its past conflicts with Hezbollah, e.g., the 2006 Lebanon War, fighting on multiple fronts could severely test its capacity to respond effectively. The risk of escalation in Syria, Iraq, and even Yemen is high, given Iran's influence in these countries. Iran could also encourage Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza to join the conflict, further increasing pressure on Israel's military and missile defense systems. A war between Israel and Iran would not take place in isolation. The broader Middle East and the international community would be deeply affected. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain view Iran as a major regional threat and could quietly support Israel's efforts to weaken Iran, even if they do not openly declare an alliance. These Gulf states have no formal military alliances with Israel, but have cooperated with Israel on intelligence and countering Iranian influence in the region. Behind-the-scenes cooperation, such as allowing Israeli aircraft to refuel in their airspace, could be a crucial factor in an Israeli preemptive strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. On the other hand, Iran enjoys support from various Shiite militias across the region, and countries like Iraq and Syria, where Iran has established a strong military presence, could be dragged into the conflict. Iran could also use its influence over these militias to launch attacks on U.S. military assets in Iraq, further complicating the regional dynamic and potentially drawing the United States deeper into the conflict. The reactions of global powers like Russia and China would also be critical. Both countries have economic and military ties to Iran and could provide diplomatic or material support in the event of an Israeli strike. Russia, in particular, has maintained a significant military presence in Syria, where it has worked closely with both the Assad regime and Iran. While Moscow would likely seek to avoid a direct military confrontation with Israel, it could use its leverage in Syria to complicate Israel's military operations in the region. The United States, as Israel's closest ally, would be in a difficult position. While the U.S. has consistently supported Israel's right to defend itself, it has also sought to avoid direct military conflict with Iran, especially after the 2003 invasion of Iraq and subsequent efforts to disengage from Middle Eastern conflicts. U.S. support for Israel in a conflict with Iran would likely be limited to intelligence sharing, diplomatic backing, and potentially resupplying Israel with critical military hardware. However, any U.S. involvement would risk escalating the conflict and drawing in other regional actors, creating a broader and more dangerous war. The outcome of a military conflict between Israel and Iran would depend heavily on how each side responds to an initial Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. If Israel's objective is limited to crippling Iran's nuclear program, it could carry out a series of precision strikes that temporarily set back Iran's nuclear ambitions without sparking a full-scale war. However, Iran is unlikely to respond passively to such an attack. A barrage of missile strikes on Israeli cities and military bases, coupled with proxy attacks on multiple fronts, would make it difficult for Israel to achieve a decisive victory without escalating the conflict further. In a full-scale war, Israel's military superiority in terms of technology, training, and organization would give it an initial advantage. Israel's air force would likely be able to destroy key Iranian military targets, including its nuclear facilities, missile launch sites, and command centers. However, Iran's strength lies in its ability to wage asymmetric warfare. By mobilizing its proxies and launching cyber attacks on Israeli infrastructure, Iran could drag Israel into a prolonged conflict that would strain its military and economic resources. A broader conflict could also have severe economic consequences for the region and the world. Iran has previously threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, a critical choke point through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply passes. A disruption in the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf would send global oil prices skyrocketing, potentially triggering a worldwide economic crisis. Such an outcome would put immense pressure on both Israel and Iran to seek a negotiated settlement before the conflict spirals out of control. In conclusion, while Israel has a qualitative edge in terms of military technology and could carry out a successful strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, the long-term consequences of such a conflict are fraught with uncertainty. Iran's capacity for asymmetric retaliation, through missile strikes, proxy warfare, and economic disruption, means that a quick and decisive Israeli victory is unlikely. Even if Israel were to achieve its immediate military objectives, the broader regional and global ramifications could be severe, with neither side emerging as a clear winner. The conflict would likely lead to a protracted war that could destabilize the Middle East, damage global economies, and result in significant human suffering. Both Israel and Iran would pay a high price, and the geopolitical and economic impacts would reverberate worldwide for years to come. A long-term conflict between Israel and Iran would fundamentally change the power dynamics in the Middle East, regardless of any immediate military success or failure. For Israel, a war against Iran is not just a matter of nuclear disarmament, but a broader attempt to ensure regional security. Israel's military superiority and technological edge give it the ability to strike decisively against Iranian assets. But the deeper question is how Israel would manage the consequences of a sustained conflict. One of the greatest challenges for Israel in a prolonged war would be dealing with the complex geopolitical fallout while maintaining domestic morale and economic stability. Iran's resilience and ability to absorb punishment is not to be underestimated. Iran has weathered sanctions, isolation, and a brutal 8-year war with Iraq, 1980 to 1988, during which it proved its capability to endure protracted conflict. Unlike Israel, which depends heavily on its international alliances, especially with the United States, Iran has built a network of influence across the Middle East that would help sustain it in a drawn-out confrontation. Iran's use of proxy warfare is particularly effective in this regard, allowing it to engage in conflicts indirectly while minimizing the immediate risk to its own forces. Furthermore, Iran's population is significantly larger than Israel's, about 86 million compared to Israel's 9 million. This demographic advantage would allow Iran to absorb heavier losses in a prolonged conflict, although it would also strain its economy and infrastructure. In contrast, Israel's small population and geographic size make it particularly vulnerable to sustained missile attacks. The psychological impact of daily missile strikes on Israeli cities, despite the country's advanced missile defense systems, could lead to significant social unrest and economic disruption. In addition to conventional military capabilities, both Israel and Iran have been developing cyber warfare capabilities, which could play a decisive role in any future conflict. Israel is considered a global leader in cybersecurity and cyber offensive capabilities, having conducted numerous cyber operations in the past. One of the most notable examples is the Stuxnet virus, a joint U.S.-Israeli operation that targeted Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities, causing significant delays in its nuclear program. Iran, too, has invested heavily in cyber warfare capabilities, using them not only against regional adversaries, but also against Western targets. In recent years, Iranian hackers have launched cyber attacks on U.S. banks, Saudi oil facilities, and Israeli infrastructure. In the event of a conflict, both Israel and Iran could use cyber attacks to disrupt each other's military communications, critical infrastructure, and civilian systems. Cyber warfare offers a means of inflicting damage without the need for physical confrontation, and both sides would likely engage in an escalating series of cyber operations alongside conventional military strikes. However, the risks of cyber warfare are not limited to direct attacks. A major cyber confrontation between Israel and Iran could have unintended consequences for global networks, given how interconnected financial systems, energy infrastructure, and military networks are. Such disruptions could cause chaos in global markets, leading to widespread economic instability that would further complicate the conflict. The domestic political impact of a war between Israel and Iran would be significant for both countries. In Israel, public support for military action would likely be high in the short term, particularly if the conflict is framed as an existential fight to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. However, as casualties mount and the economic cost of the war becomes clear, internal divisions could emerge. Israel's economy, while strong, is not immune to the strains of a prolonged conflict, especially if key infrastructure is targeted by Iranian missiles or cyber attacks. The social fabric of Israeli society, already divided along political and religious lines, could fray under the pressure of a long war. In Iran, the regime would likely use the conflict to rally domestic support, framing the war as a defense of Iranian sovereignty against foreign aggression. The Iranian government has a history of using external threats to solidify internal control, and the Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, would play a central role in both military and domestic responses to the conflict. However, Iran's economy, already weakened by years of sanctions, would suffer immensely from a prolonged war. This economic pressure, combined with the potential for large-scale civilian casualties from Israeli airstrikes, could eventually lead to internal dissent and instability. While the Iranian regime has proven adept at suppressing opposition, a prolonged war could push the country to the brink of internal collapse, especially if it exacerbates existing economic and social grievances. Regionally, the war could destabilize neighboring countries and create new opportunities for extremist groups. Iraq, already struggling with the presence of Iranian-backed militias and the remnants of ISIS, could become a battleground for proxy conflicts between Israeli and Iranian forces. Syria, where both Israel and Iran have a military presence, could see an escalation of fighting, further complicating the country's long-running civil war. Lebanon, home to Hezbollah, could be drawn into the conflict, leading to another devastating war with Israel similar to the 2006 conflict, but on a larger scale. Yemen, where Iran supports the Houthi rebels, could also become a theater of conflict, with Iranian-backed forces targeting Saudi and Emirati interests. One of the most significant global ramifications of a war between Israel and Iran would be its impact on the global economy, particularly in terms of energy markets. The Middle East remains a critical supplier of oil to the global market, and any disruption to the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf would have immediate and severe consequences. Iran has repeatedly threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which approximately 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes. If Iran were to make good on this threat, it would lead to a sharp spike in global oil prices, which could trigger a broader economic crisis. Even if the Strait of Hormuz remains open, the conflict would likely lead to disruptions in oil production and transportation, particularly if Iranian missile strikes target key infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. Such disruptions would be particularly damaging to energy-dependent economies in Asia and Europe, which rely heavily on Middle Eastern oil. The United States, which has become less dependent on Middle Eastern oil due to its own production capabilities, would still feel the effects of a global economic downturn caused by the conflict. Beyond oil, a prolonged war could disrupt global trade routes and create uncertainty in international markets. Investors tend to respond negatively to geopolitical instability, and a major conflict in the Middle East could trigger a flight to safety, with capital moving out of emerging markets and into safer assets such as U.S. Treasury bonds. This shift could lead to a decline in investment in developing economies, further exacerbating global inequality and slowing economic growth. The involvement of external powers would be another critical factor in determining the outcome of the conflict. The United States, as Israel's primary ally, would face immense pressure to provide support, even if it is reluctant to engage directly in the conflict. U.S. military assistance to Israel, in the form of intelligence sharing, resupply of weapons, and diplomatic backing, would be crucial in helping Israel sustain a prolonged conflict. However, direct U.S. involvement, such as airstrikes on Iranian targets or the deployment of U.S. forces to the region, would escalate the conflict significantly and could lead to broader regional instability. Russia and China, both of which have close economic and military ties to Iran, would likely oppose any Israeli strike and could provide material or diplomatic support to Tehran. Russia, in particular, has a strong military presence in Syria and could use its influence there to complicate Israeli operations. Moscow may also seek to mediate the conflict to protect its interests in the region and avoid a broader war that could threaten its own strategic goals. China, while less directly involved in the Middle East's military conflicts, has significant economic interests in the region, particularly through its Belt and Road Initiative. Beijing would likely push for a diplomatic resolution to the conflict to avoid disruptions to its trade routes and energy supplies. Both Russia and China would also likely use their positions on the UN Security Council to block any international resolutions that legitimize Israeli military actions against Iran. In sum, a military conflict between Israel and Iran would be a complex, multifaceted war with no clear winner. While Israel has the technological and military advantage to carry out a successful strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, the broader conflict that would follow could drag on for years, destabilizing the entire region and creating unpredictable global consequences. Iran's strength lies in its ability to wage asymmetric warfare, using its missile arsenal and network of proxies to turn the conflict into a regional war. The economic, political, and humanitarian costs would be staggering, with neither Israel nor Iran emerging unscathed. Ultimately, the outcome of such a conflict would depend on numerous factors, including the extent of international involvement, the resilience of each country's population and economy, and the willingness of regional and global powers to intervene. Both countries would suffer immense losses, and the long-term ramifications would be felt far beyond the Middle East, affecting global markets, energy supplies, and geopolitical stability. The prospect of such a war underscores the importance of continued diplomatic efforts to resolve the underlying tensions between Israel and Iran, as the alternative would likely lead to catastrophic consequences for both countries and the world. The aftermath of a war between Israel and Iran, should it come to pass, would reshape not only the two countries involved but also the broader international system. In this highly interconnected global order, conflicts of this magnitude tend to transcend borders and generate ripple effects that are often unpredictable. While both Israel and Iran have distinct objectives and military strategies, the very nature of modern warfare, particularly involving two well-armed nations with advanced capabilities, means that the resulting damage could be far more extensive than anticipated. In the wake of a direct conflict between Israel and Iran, both countries would face the daunting task of national reconstruction. In Israel, even if it successfully neutralizes Iran's nuclear program, the immediate aftermath would likely see a country grappling with a battered economy, widespread infrastructure damage from missile strikes, and a potentially divided population. Israel's high-tech economy, which depends on stability, could experience a significant downturn, especially if key sectors such as tourism, technology, and agriculture are hit by the conflict. Rebuilding damaged infrastructure, particularly in the face of sustained rocket and missile attacks, would require substantial international assistance, something that could stretch even Israel's formidable alliances. Iran, too, would suffer immensely in a post-war scenario. While its ability to wage asymmetric warfare through proxies and missile attacks gives it strategic depth, the economic toll would be profound. Iran's oil industry, already weakened by international sanctions, would likely be further crippled by Israeli strikes on its energy infrastructure. The internal cost of sustaining a prolonged war, combined with the damage to vital infrastructure, could exacerbate existing economic crises and lead to greater internal dissent. Iran's political leadership would have to navigate a population increasingly weary of conflict and economic hardship, which could spark civil unrest or even regime instability. Moreover, both nations would have to contend with the broader regional consequences of the war. For Israel, a potential victory over Iran's nuclear ambitions could come at the cost of heightened insecurity on multiple fronts. Iran's proxies in Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria might remain active, forcing Israel to engage in continuous military operations to defend its borders. The instability caused by the war could also lead to the empowerment of extremist groups, further complicating Israel's security environment. In Iran, the war could prompt a realignment of power structures within the country. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, already a dominant force in Iranian politics and military strategy, could emerge from the conflict with even greater influence, particularly if it plays a central role in managing the war effort. However, such an outcome could further alienate moderate voices within Iran who might push for reform or greater engagement with the international community. The long-term effects of a war with Israel could either entrench the existing regime or lead to a recalibration of Iran's political system, depending on the war's duration and outcome. One of the most significant consequences of an Israel-Iran conflict would be its impact on regional alliances. A war between two of the Middle East's most powerful nations would force countries across the region to reassess their foreign policies and alliances. The conflict could accelerate the emerging trend of normalization between Israel and several Arab states, particularly those in the Gulf. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which already share a mutual interest in countering Iranian influence, might find themselves further aligning with Israel in the face of a common adversary. Saudi Arabia, in particular, would face a delicate balancing act. While it has historically maintained a policy of non-recognition towards Israel, the rise of Iranian influence in the region has pushed Riyadh closer to informal cooperation with Israel on security matters. A war with Iran could push Saudi Arabia towards a more overt partnership with Israel, particularly if Iranian missile strikes threaten Saudi oil facilities or other key infrastructure. Such a realignment would have significant implications for the region's political landscape, potentially leading to a new bloc of Sunni Arab states aligned with Israel against Iranian influence. On the other hand, Iran's alliances with non-state actors like Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, and the Houthis in Yemen would likely intensify during and after the conflict. Iran's ability to project power through its proxies has long been a cornerstone of its regional strategy, and a direct confrontation with Israel would only reinforce the importance of these alliances. However, the war could also expose the limits of Iran's influence, particularly if the Iranian government is unable to provide sustained support to its proxies due to the strain of the conflict on its own resources. Additionally, the war could lead to shifts in Turkey's regional strategy. While Turkey has had its own complex relationship with both Israel and Iran, a prolonged conflict might force Ankara to choose sides more decisively. Turkey's strategic interests in Syria, Iraq, and the broader Middle East would be directly impacted by the fallout of an Israel-Iran war, and its leadership would have to navigate these shifting alliances carefully to preserve its own regional ambitions. As the conflict drags on, there would inevitably be calls for international mediation to prevent further escalation and bring about a ceasefire. the United Nations, which has traditionally played a role in mediating conflicts in the Middle East, would likely step in early to try to broker negotiations between the two parties. However, given the deep-rooted animosity between Israel and Iran, as well as the complexities of their respective domestic politics, achieving a lasting peace agreement would be a formidable challenge. The United States, as Israel's closest ally, would play a key role in any diplomatic efforts. While Washington would likely support Israel's right to defend itself, the broader U.S. interest in preventing a wider regional war would push American policymakers towards advocating for a diplomatic solution. The U.S. would also have to balance its support for Israel with the need to maintain relationships with other regional powers, particularly in the Gulf, which would be wary of being dragged into the conflict. Russia and China, both of whom have significant interests in Iran, would also be key players in any peace negotiations. Russia, in particular, has a strong military presence in Syria and has worked closely with Iran in supporting the Assad regime. Moscow would likely seek to position itself as a mediator, using its influence with Tehran to push for a ceasefire. However, Russia's primary concern would be maintaining stability in Syria and protecting its strategic interests in the region. China, while less directly involved in the military aspects of the conflict, would be highly concerned about the economic implications of a prolonged war, particularly with regard to oil supplies. Beijing could use its economic leverage over both Iran and Israel to encourage a diplomatic resolution, but its role in any negotiations would likely be more behind the scenes. The European Union would also push for a diplomatic solution, particularly given its role in negotiating the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. European countries would likely be more cautious in supporting Israeli military action, particularly if it led to a broader regional war. However, Europe's influence in the region has waned in recent years, and its ability to mediate a conflict of this scale would be limited. In the end, it is entirely possible that a war between Israel and Iran could end in a stalemate, with neither side able to claim a decisive victory. Israel might succeed in severely damaging Iran's nuclear infrastructure, but the broader conflict would likely drag on for years, with periodic flare-ups of violence. Iran, for its part, might succeed in inflicting significant damage on Israel through missile strikes and proxy warfare, but it would be unable to overcome Israel's superior military technology and missile defense systems. A stalemate would have profound implications for the region. The conflict would likely continue to simmer, with both sides engaging in periodic skirmishes and proxy battles across the Middle East. The long-term consequences of such a conflict would include continued instability in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, as well as the potential for a broader confrontation involving other regional powers. One of the most important lessons to be drawn from past conflicts in the Middle East is the difficulty of achieving a clear-cut victory. The wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria have all demonstrated that military intervention in the region often leads to prolonged conflict with no easy resolution. The complexities of the Israel-Iran rivalry, combined with the involvement of numerous external actors, mean that a war between the two would likely follow a similar trajectory. Ultimately, the only way to avoid the catastrophic consequences of such a conflict is through continued diplomatic engagement and efforts to address the underlying security concerns of both countries. While the prospect of a military confrontation between Israel and Iran remains a real and pressing danger, the long-term interests of both countries and the broader international community lie in finding a peaceful solution to the tensions that have defined their relationship for decades. In conclusion, while Israel's military superiority and technological advancements would give it an early edge in a war with Iran, the broader conflict would be characterized by asymmetry, regional destabilization, and global economic disruptions. Neither side is likely to emerge as a clear winner, and the war's consequences would be felt far beyond the Middle East. The unpredictable nature of modern warfare, combined with the high stakes of a direct confrontation between two powerful nations, underscores the importance of diplomatic efforts to prevent such a conflict from occurring in the first place.